Soy Héctor 3.
Héctor 2.
Héctor 1. Soy Héctor 3.
Héctor 2.
Héctor 1. Soy Héctor 3.
Héctor 2.
Héctor 1. Soy Héctor 3.
Hello, buenos dias, and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, the podcast trapped in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. This season, we're discussing Triangle and Timecrimes. I'm your host, Bubbawheat, and in this episode, we are discussing the third and final loop in Timecrimes that starts at 70 minutes and 19 seconds, with Hector emerging from the time machine tank, and ends at the end of the movie. And today my guest is Nick Jobe from Infoblast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
That's good to hear. So before we get started talking about this loop, I did want to ask you how you discovered this movie and what's your history with this movie? Because I believe that I talked to Jason earlier and he said that you were the one that introduced him to this movie.
Yeah, I don't remember how I came across this movie. I probably was into a bunch of time travel or time loop style movies at the time, and I don't know if I rented it or if I honestly don't remember. I have no recollection of how I first came across it. I do know it. Yeah, I introduced Jason to it. And it became like one of his favorite movies. And he had some words with on social media with the director and all sorts. But yeah, so it's kind of a boring answer, but I don't remember. But I've known this movie for a very long time. Probably since right around when it first came out. But yeah, I do recommend people check this out if they haven't seen it. It's definitely worth your time if you're like a time loop fan.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Watching it for this show was the first time that I watched it, and I've really enjoyed it. I'm not sure if this one is my favorite because I really love Triangle, but Triangle and Timecrimes are very neck and neck with my favorite for this season, which it's only three movies, so it's not exactly a high bar, but I have really loved both of those movies. And Time Loop was okay. It's not an awful movie, but it was definitely not nearly as good as Triangle or Timecrimes.
Yeah, Triangle and Timecrimes definitely are both kind of gold standards of the genre. They're very, very, very similar. The plots are pretty, or at least the concepts of the plots are pretty similar, and then they just do them in entirely unique ways.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get right down to this loop. So, one thing that I noticed that I like about this loop versus the start of the previous one is the way that it's cut, and it almost looks like the machine shut and then just immediately reopened afterwards. Like there's almost a moment where you think that the machine didn't actually work until you realize that the tech, he has this confused look on his face. And then you realize that this is him freshly meeting any of the Hectors. Like, this is really kind of the start, like the chronological start of the movie.
Yeah, and it's what, Hector 3 at this point?
Yes.
And so Hector 3 is technically the first Hector that he meets. So it's almost going like in reverse chronological for him.
And almost immediately Hector just slaps him.
Yeah.
And that's really just thinking about the difference between Hector 3 versus Hector 1. Like, Hector 1 would never act this way. He was, and this is only like the course of maybe 3 or 4 hours that all this is
Yeah.
going on. And you can see that Hector is very physically changed. He's been in 2 car accidents and he's been stabbed in the arm, but he's also changed very much mentally as well. Like, he's a very different character. Hector 3 is a very different character than Hector 1.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he's it's for sure like his he's been through so much chaos, and like it had to change him so quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that this is an interesting reversal, because the first time that we were introduced to the technician was the one that more or less knew what was going on, and Hector had no idea about anything. And then in this situation, the roles are reversed. Now it's Hector that is experienced, and he knows exactly what's going on throughout this whole system. And the tech is the one that has no idea of what's going on with all these events happening around him, with these 2 identical men coming out of this time machine. Like, he knows that it's a time machine, and this is what it's supposed to do. But just the fact that it actually has been used today with an actual person.
Yeah, and it's almost, where, like Memento, where you have one going forward and one kind of going backwards. And this is like the meeting point in the middle, where Hector is now moving, like he's kind of at the end of his journey, whereas the tech's at the beginning of his. And so they are going on reverse paths throughout the movie.
Right. And you can see that this is the start of, like, Hector 3 is like the puppet master in a way, because he's the one that's controlling all of the events that we've seen throughout the movie, like starting with the in a way, like not specifically the naked woman, but everything to do with the technician. He's the one that's basically orchestrated all of this.
Right.
And we see him get into the golf cart, and he drives past, and it's fun because we get to see this scene right here from a different angle, because we saw this scene with Hector 2 and the technician just sitting on the grass right after he saw himself, right after he saw Hector 1 at home. And the first time around, we see this scene, the 2 of them, and it's like a close-up of their faces. And he's like, Hector 2 talks about seeing Hector 1. And then like, he's talking about the time machine. And you see the tech look back behind him both ways, and you think, oh, he's looking back at the time machine. And now we're seeing it from this wider angle, and you realize, no, he's not looking at the time machine. He's looking at Hector 3 driving past him in a golf cart.
Yeah. Yeah, how it just expands on everything that we've gotten before.
And we kind of see how a lot of these pieces fit together. It's like we're seeing that scene in a slightly different view, because we know more of what's going on. It's in a previous interview I saw that Nacho described this film like that the concept of the film is like it's a murder mystery, or like a crime mystery, where the person investigating the crime and the person pulling the strings and the person committing the crime are all the same person.
Yeah.
But at different points in time.
Yeah, for sure. And again, a little Memento there. But yeah, no, it's a really fascinating take on this kind of story, where it's just because of how the time travel works in this movie. You have all parts of the puzzle, and it's all the same part of the puzzle, but you don't know that until the end. Like, it's just all the same person.
And then we get I like to think of this as like another slight reminder of the schlubby Hector. Like, even though he is kind of the puppet master at this point, and he knows everything that's going on. He still makes some mistakes. Like we see him pull up to the locked gate and realize, oh, he doesn't have the key to open the gate, and he's in a golf cart, which is not exactly powerful enough to bust through it. Plus the fact that, that the gate has to work for the other Hectors. So even if he wasn't something powerful enough to bust through it, I don't think that he would have at this point.
Right.
Because we've already seen that this Hector, starting with Hector 2, he's someone that he does not want to change the timeline that's already happened. So he's not willing to make changes to events that he's already seen and experienced.
Yeah, so now he's just on a mission to kind of fulfill the timeline.
Mm-hmm. And so he gets this, this van, this red van from the tech, and we get this, a very extremely minor action movie moment. And I think in this whole scene in general has the most like near misses and almost interactions between multiple Hectors, because we do have both of the Hectors kind of interacting with each other, interacting near each other at several different points. And then he has this almost an action scene where he has to hurry and get through the gates that Hector 2 opened before they close.
Yeah. And I like, he's just like, oh, and don't, no, not the white car. Not the white, I can't anything but the white car. And then he's like, oh, I have this truck. So he just kind of go on from there, but how he already knows what he can and can't do.
And we get a new shot of the woman on the bicycle, and this is right before Hector 3 drives the van into Hector 2's white car, the one that he just stole from the lab. And now both of them are basically involved in the same accidents in different parts of the road. And we also we get to see the knocking over of the dumpster, which is where his his trash trench coat came from. And so now we are about to see a Hector who has survived 2 car accidents and a stab wound. And he's looking pretty rough about this point.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of bruising. His face is really banged up. And I think they did a really good job of the makeup. Like he looks extremely beaten up and swollen and bloody, but not like he looks like he could still be standing.
Yeah.
He gets a new walkie-talkie that spilled out of the back of the van, and he's having this conversation with the tech. And I like this conversation because at first it appears like he's having this heart-to-heart. He apologizes for the trouble that's likely to come down on the tech, asks him why he turned on the time machine in the first place. And then Hector vaguely threatens the tech to keep Hector 2 out of the tank. And then we get the punchline that he only says this because he knows that Hector 2 is going to hit him.
It's definitely interesting. He's still trying, in that essence, you have kind of Hector 3 is kind of at this crossroads here because he's going through with the timeline. Like he's like, all right, we got to do this, and we got to kind of make sure everything kind of goes as it has been. But then at this moment, he's like, do not let Hector 2 in. So he's still trying. It's like one last ditch effort to kind of try to stop things from happening.
Well, I don't think it's him trying to stop things, because he says at the end of that conversation, it's like, but basically, that'll show the deck. Like he's basically saying, I just told him that so that Hector 2 will hit him. And I think that really kind of clues into what his mental state is, because Hector 2, hits the tech out of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
But this feels like it's more like vindictiveness. He's
That's
doing
true.
this to, like, not necessarily out of anger, but he's doing it almost to get joy out of the tech's pain. Like, I wouldn't go so far as to say evil, but it's a bit more like prurient attitude towards it.
Yeah. Well, that's true because he does ask him, like you were saying, he goes, why'd you even turn it on? Why'd you turn it on?
Mhm.
And so he is like frustrated with him, and he's like mad because none of this or all of this could have been avoided if that tech wouldn't have just turned it on to begin with.
Mhm.
And so yeah, he's like asking him about that, and now it's kind of his comeuppance, or the punishment from Hector to the tech, in a roundabout kind of way.
Yeah, and it's weird because this is like we're seeing the what caused him getting hit, but we basically have already seen his punishment.
Hmm. Yeah. So it just adds a new layer behind it.
Mhm. And then we get to see the woman um, running away after she uh, came to after she regained consciousness, and she sees Hector 3. And she, at this point, she doesn't realize that they're the same person, because she never sees him with the bandages fully off.
Yeah.
And he was also wearing a different overshirt as well, even though he's wearing the same pants, but they're just generic khakis. So it's
Mm.
I don't think it would be weird for her to think of two men with roughly the same build wearing the same
Right.
khaki pants. So I don't think that she makes the connection that they're the same person.
Right. And if she's, freaked out with what just happened and kind of confused, it makes sense that, she's not putting two and two together.
Yeah, and then we also get this brief jump to seeing Hector 2 with the bandages. And the scream is also this audio clue that helps connect the timeline of the two different arcs, the second and third loop, because you definitely hear the scream in the second and the third loop. I don't think you hear it in the first loop.
Yeah. I don't remember.
And the one thing that I do think is weird is we get this fade to black as Hector 3 passes out and then wakes up. And it's this slight time jump, because whenever he passes out, it was dark, or it was light, and now that he wakes up, it's dark.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that feels like there shouldn't be that much of a time jump, because in the previous loop, whenever Hector 2 hears the scream, I feel like he immediately goes to the house. And all of these events that we're about to see from Hector 3's perspective all happen. And yet we're seeing it here where he passes out for some unknown amount of time, probably at least like 15 minutes, enough for the sun, enough to go from sunset to after dusk.
Yeah.
And yet he and this woman get back to his house before Hector 2.
I mean, maybe it was, yeah, I don't know. It could be a plot hole. Could be,
Yeah. I feel like that is like,
unless he just got lost in the woods heading back to his house.
yeah, it could be that. Like there could have been a time jump in the second loop as well. And I think it's weird too that he and the woman go back to his house, and Hector 3 doesn't reveal that this is his house. The woman just thinks that it's some random house, and she leaves him to sit down while she goes off to find the phone. And then somehow she doesn't cross paths with Clara, who just a minute later, she comes back from the exact same direction, and she sees Hector, and she immediately recognizes him, but clearly is surprised because he is much in way worse shape than he was when she last saw him.
Right. So she's just like, what happened?
Yeah, exactly. And Hector downplays his injuries so that he can focus on what needs to be done. And Clara mentions that she had already called the police on Hector too. Of course, she didn't know that it was Hector too, but on this bandaged man, which is why whenever Hector 2 finds the phone cradle, the charging cradle, that it was empty. And so now we get Hector 3, which at this point, I believe that Hector 3 still believes that the dead body that he saw was Clara's body. So he's like leading her into this like storage room out, like just outside. And I believe he's doing this because he's trying to keep her safe.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know. Do you think that Hector 3 has the full plan mapped out in his head yet, or do you think that he kind of comes up with it in the moment?
I think he kind of comes up with it in the moment up until the bit with the jacket. Like I think like he's kind of realizing it as he's going at this point, but I think here in just a little bit that it's all going to kind of click, and you'll see it on his face when he kind of realizes what has to be done.
Yeah,
But yeah, right now I don't think he's fully clicked yet, but he's getting there.
yeah, because I think he also, he pulls the ladder out of this room. I think possibly a little bit to make some extra room for Clara to get in there, because we don't really see a good look inside the room, but it's probably cluttered in there. And I think it's also a bit of him making things happen the way that he remembered them, because he remembers seeing the ladder on the laying on the house this way.
Yeah.
And especially, I think this especially is true because like after he comes in, the window shuts itself, and then he takes a moment to reopen the window because he remembers that the window was open whenever he, as Hector 2, came in this room. So he knows that that will buy him a little extra time as Hector 2 goes out. And he comes back in, and then we see the table, which is the same table that Clara said would not fit in the bedroom. And I love just this no look toss.
Yeah, just really showing that he knows exactly what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. At this point in time, Hector 3 is fully in charge of this timeline, and he's like, he remembers exactly what time it was when he got hit by the table, and so he's just no look toss. Yeah, either that, or I think it's also he kind of puts his blind faith into fate, and he realized that all this is happening through some sort of fate that's controlling this timeline. And so he's like, well, I'm just going to throw the table because he knows that it works because it already worked. Has this moment with this woman, and I still, I've done 4 episodes, and it's still tough for me to refer to her as the woman because she is never named.
Yeah.
And Clara's Clara's jacket just happens to be right there in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we get a good look, but I think it's interesting that I feel like the jacket matches her pants, because she is wearing like these bright red pants, and Clara's jacket is a bright red jacket. And Hector 3 comes up with this story that he needs to cut her hair in order to, I guess, disguise her from the bandaged man, as his explanation to her. But I do think that this this moment where the two of them are in this room is, like you said, where this plan fully clicks into place.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think when he sees her across the hallway right before he tosses the table, that's when it starts kind of clicking into place. And even, that blind toss too could have been him going like, well, hell, like now we have to do this. And he tosses the table, walks across, sees the jacket, and then it all kind of clicks into place. And he knows exactly what has to be done, and he is not thrilled about it.
Mhm. Like
And
he
just
does
kind
have
of,
this moment, like
yeah.
this brief quiet moment where he just looks at her, and the two of them are looking at each other, and then he tells her that she's beautiful.
Mhm.
Like, what's your take on, like, why do you think that he takes the time to tell this woman that she's beautiful?
Their relationship basically starts off with him uh viewing her naked, like through with his binoculars.
Mm,
And so it starts off basically with just this notion of looking at her beauty, like just a visual attraction. And so to end their relationship with him kind of bringing that full circle and just vocalizing that, he was peeping on her earlier, but now he's just kind of made it more emotional to where like he knows he's sending her to her death. And so it's kind of his last time to say one, something nice to her, but also bring that whole story uh looped back around, so to speak. Um so I think that's pretty much how I interpret that.
yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. So then Hector, he goes back downstairs to Clara and takes her out into the yard, which I believe that he does this in large part to give himself an alibi.
Hmm.
And we hear the woman scream, and Clara starts to get up, but Hector stops her. And then we hear the thunder, which the thunder is like one of the few audio markers that connects all three loops, because it is this audio event that happens across all three loops.
Hmm.
I think it has a multiple purpose. Like, one is to help you understand what the timeline is, like where they are in time.
Hmm.
And it's also used as this like foreboding. And it's
Right.
kind of used in a different way each time to a certain extent. Because I think the first time it's this like general foreshadowing foreboding
Hmm.
that's about all the events that are going to happen. And then in the second one, it's kind of the foreshadowing of the rain that's about to happen. And also, the events of the third loop. And then
Yeah.
this one, I feel like it's almost, it's a foreboding of the future of Hector's life after this.
Yeah.
And I didn't notice this before, but we get this close up of Hector and Clara sitting on these lawn chairs side by side, and Clara is in the foreground, and you can see her just like quivering with fear.
Hmm. Then Hector just reaches over and snatches her arm to
Mhm.
keep her there.
And then she's not really calmed down by this.
Yeah.
She still has this very fearful
Like,
breathing.
what is happening?
Mm. And I didn't really give it too much thought, but I don't think that the fear is entirely just for the bandaged person. I think that there's also some amount of fear about the Hector that's beside her.
Yeah. Or just the unknown too. Like, she doesn't know what's happening and he's being kind of weird. So,
Mm.
and he's all beat up and she hears noises. And so, yeah, I'd be freaked out too.
Yeah, the Hector at the beginning, he was like, he drove down to IKEA to get some supplies, and just going shopping wore him out enough that he needed to take a nap.
Mhm.
And this is a Hector that is, his face is all bloody and he's got open wounds and he's acting like nothing's happened.
Yeah.
So it really, like, especially from Claire's point of view, it's like he really feels like a different person to her. And then we see Hector pull the hair cutting scissors out of his pocket and then just throw them behind himself.
Mhm.
Like, what's your take on why he does that?
Well, I guess are those the same scissors that he gets stabbed with?
Yes.
Yeah. So it could just be kind of an ending of that journey as well.
Yeah, just like literally putting that behind him.
Yeah, like yeah, just very kind of literal in that sense. Like it's done. Like this journey is over. The the violence is over after this. I'm completely done with this crazy loop thing that's happening right now.
At first, I almost thought that that's not necessarily the smartest thing to do,
Hmm.
because it is like this weapon that has blood on it. Then I remembered that if in the police investigation that happens after this film, if they did test the blood, the only blood on it would be his own blood.
Right. And his own fingerprints, and they're his. So like,
Mhm.
there's nothing, even if they found it, nothing that they could use it for.
Yeah, although it's I mean that there is the possibility that the woman's fingerprints might still be on there, but I think that's
Yeah.
doubtful just because that with as much as he's handled it and
Right.
with the smaller surface area, I don't think that even if her even if any of her fingerprints were still on the scissors, I don't think there would be enough of it to get a clear print.
Yeah. No, I'm with you.
And then the film ends with this panning shot, and it goes over the roof, and we see the broken bits of tile where the woman fell, and we see her body on the ground in Clara's coat and the matching red pants. And do you think that in a way that's almost part of fate, just the fact that her pants matched her jacket?
I never thought about that. Quite possibly, that we don't know if the wife had pants, right? Like that were the same. So it's just coincidence that she had a matching outfit.
Yeah, because like especially in this shot, I mean, I know the quality is not great, but they
Yeah.
look like exactly the same color.
Right. And it could symbolize, because it's like basically orange or red, so it just symbolizes blood and the
Danger.
violence. Yeah.
And then the last thing that we see is that Hector's um, black SUV driving off up to the silo. It's with Hector 2 in it, and Hector 2 goes up to the technician to go back in time.
Hmm.
So with the SUV sitting at the silo, and the only person up there at the silo is the tech, do you think that when the police do come, that the technician would be the prime suspect?
Um, that's actually a good question. Probably, because you know the the Hector and Clara have an alibi,
Mhm.
unless they're co-suspects.
Yeah, I was about to say
Yeah,
they are a married couple, so and there aren't any other witnesses to their whereabouts, so
but
that
he has, his blood was on the scissors. He's completely beaten up. she's not frightened by him to a point where, like, she would accuse him of something.
Well, I did actually have this theory that, it's not so much presented within the context of the film and how they interact with each other, but because there is like a very specific quote that she says that stood out to me, whenever she says, I'd rather lose the bet than have you against me. And I know that in general, their interactions, her body language and the way that they communicate with each other, it doesn't seem like there's any signs of abuse or anything. Like they feel
Right.
like they have a very complacent relationship. Like,
Yeah.
I think boring is probably the best way for me to describe it. A couple that's probably been married for over 10 years.
Right.
And
And it kind of shows why he was peeping with the binoculars earlier too.
mm, I do think that line kind of stood out to me, and it's also possibly just a problem with the translation, that maybe that there's a subtlety in the original Spanish that's not necessarily coming through with the text subtitles. But it did make me think that there was the possibility of some strife in their relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through more here at the end, because she is not necessarily scared of him, but she's definitely scared with him next to her, and
Yeah.
she's not comforted by his presence.
Well, and let me put this question past you. Uh, and correct me if I'm wrong, if this could be something stated earlier in the film, maybe by the tech, but did Hector 3 have to do any of it? Did he have to complete the loop, or did he just think he had to complete the loop?
Well, the reason that he came back was because he thought Clara died, and so
Right.
he's coming back because he thinks that he can change things and save her. And then it's not. And
By
go
the time
ahead.
he gets to the woman and the whole coat scene and all of that, he knows at that point that it's not his wife. Did he
Hmm.
have to go through with it, or could he have just not done anything and saved both lives?
I think at that point, it's he they never drew a diagram with a third Hector. They always just assumed that there was two of them whenever they had the discussion. But I think that he's still going on with the fact that he knows that Hector 2 also needs to go back into the time machine so that there's only one Hector. And I think his from his point of view, the only way that Hector 2 will go back into the time machine is if Hector 2 thinks that Clara died.
He's just cleaning up the timeline.
Yeah. And again, he's just doing things, he's doing things because they happened. And
Yeah.
so it's almost like I've explained it before, and this whole season is it's almost like he has a lack of free will,
Yeah.
because he's going through with events that have already happened. And so he has no choice in the actions that he takes, because these events have already happened. And so they have to happen this exact same way. And he's just following along on these guided rails.
So then it brings me the question, what would happen if he didn't? Like, say he didn't complete that loop and he didn't send Hector 2 back to the time machine, and then Clara and the woman live. What ultimately, I guess, within the world this movie presents, what would have happened, I wonder? Would there have just been two Hectors in the world? I mean, he knew at this point that he was facing himself, so it's not like the knowledge of his other existence is, mind melting, or they're not going to explode if they know they both exist. because he's getting to a point, Hector 2 is getting to a point where he's also learning this information. So theoretically, he could just confront his past self and just coexist.
Yeah, I think that would be a possibility but it would have to completely change the concept of the time travel as presented. Because I feel like the way that the time travel is presented, that is an impossibility.
Yeah.
Because there is, like in this theory of time travel, there is only one timeline. This doesn't account for the possibility of branching timelines. And
So the
so
TVA is stepping in and forcing him to behave this way.
yeah, basically, if he did change course, then that entire existence would get erased, because this is the I forget the terminology, the golden timeline.
Right. So yeah, so then what you're saying is true then, like he has no free will, and the existence of this time travel is basically forcing his hand. So is he then still, like, ultimately, is he still guilty, or is it his fault, or is it not his fault? Even though it's just kind of an accident, ultimately it's an accident. Is he still?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, because from Hector 2's point of view, it was just an accident, but from Hector 3's point of view, like he knows that the accident is going to happen, and even though he didn't physically cause it, he did basically,
He set it up.
yeah, he set the events up. It's almost like,
so that is interesting, because then, so Hector 2, it's an accident from Hector 2's perspective, but Hector 3, even though they're the exact same person, it is basically murder, because he is sending her to die, even though accidentally, by his own self, knowing that she was going to die the direction he was sending her.
it's almost like he, in a way you could think of it as Hector 3 is like Jigsaw, and this complicated time travel death trap exists, and then he's sending the woman into this time travel created death trap.
Right.
And so yeah, in that way, Hector 3 is a murderer, and because he's the one that causes the death of the woman.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's definitely you can try to pick it apart, but it's pretty tight.
Yeah, through the whole thing, I only found like a couple minor like potential plot holes, like the one that I brought up in this one.
Right.
And then at one point, I believe Hector 2 throws the walkie-talkie in the woods, but then later on, Hector 3 has it. Or I think Hector 2 has the walkie-talkie again, even though he never picked it up again. But I think that pretty much wraps it up. This has been really interesting following Hector through this character journey and into. It's funny because it's like it's him making himself into a murderer.
Yeah.
Without realizing it, and almost without any free will, because Hector 1, you can also look at it as Hector 1 is kind of being controlled by the events of things that are happening around him.
Yeah.
That are being caused by Hector 2 and Hector 3.
And ultimately, I guess if you are to place blame, it is the tech's fault for starting the machine. So making him the lead suspect is really correct, because you don't have it's not really Hector's fault if the tech turned this on, and then Hector is stuck in a loop of obligation and lack of free will, and now he has to keep performing the same things that are happening, even though like he's not in control, but the tech set it in motion.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, yeah, like I said, that wraps up Timecrimes. Is there anything else that you want to mention about this movie or about the any of the earlier loot?
No, I think we had a pretty good brain melt thought there near the end. Yeah, I don't really have anything else. It's it's a really good time loop movie. I strongly recommend it if you like it, like this kind of genre. It's a great, that triangle is another one, like you mentioned too, are both fantastic examples of this type of story.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking with me about this film. I know, whenever I brought it up, you were one of the relatively smaller handful of people that had seen this film and wanted to come on and talk about it. So I'm glad that we were able to make the time to talk about a portion of this film. And for anybody else that's listening, why don't you go ahead and take a moment to let them know where they can find you and your work online?
You can find Infoblast on pretty much anything you listen to: Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and everything else at Rabbit Hole Podcast at rabbitholepodcast.com. And yeah, that's about the bulk of it.
And as always, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me at flightstitesandmovienights.com. You can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, on anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. And we also have a Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group. You can join that and discuss episodes as they come out. You can also discuss time loops in general. And even though we did finish up Timecrimes, tune in next week, and I have one final special episode about Timecrimes. I was able to interview the writer, director, and the technician himself, Nacho Vigalondo. So tune in next week to listen to that interview and wrap up this film and this season. So until next time.
Soy Hector 3.
Hector 2.
Hector 1. Soy Hector 3.
Hector 2.
Hector 1. Soy Hector 3.